Greetings, travelers and tourists. Welcome to my channel where we talk about role-playing games like Pathfinder and Starfinder. My name is Mark and I am the local disaster tour guide. That's right, I am a storyteller that is reminding you always travel with someone with lots of HP because your party will need a backup trap handler. Today, we are continuing the Classics Introduction series on this channel, a series where we examine different classes inside of role-playing games. Right now, we are working through the classes in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and in particular, we have started with the 4 iconic character classes in almost any RPG system out there: the Fighter, the Rogue, the Cleric, and the Wizard. Last week, we looked at the Fighter class, and today we are moving on to the highly skilled but morally questionable con artists and thieves, the literal rogues gallery of your adventuring party, the Rogue class. We're going to talk about what the Rogue class has to offer, and we're going to take a look at its strengths and weaknesses and examine what it brings to the table during your Pathfinder 2nd Edition games. In our Classics Introduction series, we look at each class through the same 5 questions. Number 1, what is the class? Number 2, what are the strengths of the class? Number 3, what are the weaknesses of the class? Number 4, what character build options does the class give me? And last but certainly not least, how can I get the most out of this class? So, let's get started. Now, I would like to begin today's conversation by acknowledging a personal bias when it comes to the Rogue class, which is, historically, I have not enjoyed Rogue-style characters. On the few occasions that I am actually playing in an RPG rather than storytelling an RPG, I almost never go for a rogue class or a scoundrel class or anything in that general archetype. It's just not a character concept that I usually enjoy. Historically, I've understood the reason for the rogue class in RPG systems. It's just never really been a class that has appealed to me very much. Which is why Pathfinder 2nd Edition really surprised me. I did not anticipate everything that Paizo was going to bring to the table with the Rogue class in this edition, and I am truly amazed by just how well the Rogue class is constructed in Pathfinder 2e. So I have to give a win to Paizo here. You have taken a skeptic when it comes to the Rogue class and made me a fan. This class is one of my favorites in this game, and today I'm going to get to share a little bit of why that is true. But let's start with that first question. What is the Rogue class? Historically, when we think about the Rogue class, the first image that comes to mind is the thief, the pickpocket, the scoundrel, the swindler, the person who is using every trick at their disposal to separate you from your hard-earned gold. The Rogue character class is one that relies often on stealth and deception in order to achieve its ends. Last week we talked about the Fighter class, a class that is prone to charging headlong into battle because they have the martial skill to go toe-to-toe with any foe. The Rogue, however, has never met a cheap tactic that they don't like. This is the quintessential class for people who enjoy playing characters that rely on wit, that rely on strategy, that rely on unconventional methods to achieve their ends. When we look at the first question, what is this class? I tend to talk about classes in 3 different categories, if you will. First, what is the role of the class? Second, what is the overall complexity of the class? And third, what are the key terms or ideas that you need to be familiar with to be proficient in playing this class? Well, there is an old gamer term that applies very, very strongly to the Pathfinder 2nd Edition Rogue, and that is the skill monkey. Skill monkey is an old gamer term for utility characters. Characters who are not as focused on the combat side of the game, but who bring a lot of utility to non-combat encounters. The most classic example for the Rogue being finding and disabling those brutal traps that the DM has left in the dungeon. Skill monkey characters are characters who have a diverse array of talents that they can apply to situations not just in combat but outside of combat, and they can often use those abilities to give themselves an advantage when the fight actually breaks out. So compared to the fighter, you're going to be looking at a class that is not necessarily as effective in direct combat, but is going to have a lot of tools and tricks at their disposal outside of combat, and who will often use underhanded means to get an advantage during combat. In terms of overall complexity for the rogue class, this is actually one of the things that I really like about this class in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and that is that the rogue is a remarkably simple class to develop and to play. Now, I will tell you the rogue complexity varies from subclass to subclass. Certain versions of the rogue are going to be more complex than others. For example, the Eldritch Trickster subclass can have a lot of nuance to it. But even in the most complicated of cases, I still have to say that the rogue is a fairly simple class to play, and so I give the rogue class a complexity rating that ranges from 2 to 4 out of 10, depending on the subclass that you are choosing. This is a remarkably approachable class, and let me just say that if you are a brand new player to Pathfinder 2nd Edition, the rogue is actually the #1 class I would recommend for you. Now, I always say that when it comes to choosing a character inside of an RPG, that the most important factor in determining what you should play is what excites you. If there's a class that you think is extremely interesting, that you are extremely excited to play, you should always go for that over the other options, because that excitement is going to help you learn the class. But if you're not sure what you would like to play, or if the complexity of Pathfinder 2nd Edition as a system is a little bit daunting for you, the rogue class is one of the more straightforward classes, and therefore is one that I think is very approachable for brand new players. One of the things I really like about the rogue class is most of its complexity is baked into skill checks rather than combat actions. And the good thing about that distinction is skill checks are often a less intense scenario at the gaming table. Combat moves quickly and there's a lot of variables, there's a lot of things going on, and having a lot of complexity in the middle of combat can be daunting for new players. But skill challenges like breaking into the home and stealing the fancy treasure, while there is some tension there, the speed of play is often a little more paced and a little bit more approachable, and so placing the complexity of the rogue class more on the skill challenges side of the table makes it something that I think is a lot easier for new players to manage. It is amazing how Paizo has made the concept of the witty or strategic character something that is fairly easy to implement inside the game, and the design choices around the rogue, honestly, I could go on for way too long about this. Let me just say they are very well done, and this is definitely a class that I would recommend to new players who aren't sure what option might be the best for them. Now, let's talk about some key terms and key ideas that you need to be aware of if you are going to play a rogue. We're going to start with the Rogue Key Terms sidebar. When you look at any class in the Pathfinder 2nd Edition core rulebook, they actually have a sidebar that shows you some of the key terms that you need to know when you are playing that class, and the Rogue comes with 2 key terms that they want you to know: Flourish and Debilitation. Flourish is basically a key term that means once per round. These are actions that you can use in combat, but they often come with a certain degree of energy or complexity that makes them difficult to use in rapid succession. Therefore, when you have a Flourish ability, you can only use it once in a round regardless of how many actions you may have, and if you have multiple Flourish abilities, you're still only going to use one of them in a given round. You have to give yourself a little space between each Flourish in order to be able to accomplish them properly. The other key term that the Rogue class gives us is Debilitation. And Debilitation is an add-on to one of the Rogue class's core abilities, Sneak Attack. So to understand debilitations, you have to understand Sneak Attack. Sneak attack is a classic rogue ability that basically just means if you catch someone off guard, you get to deal extra damage. It's extra d6s of damage added when you strike an opponent who is flat-footed. Starting around rogue level 9, rogues pick up abilities called debilitations, which improve their sneak attack. Basically, you can think of them as debuffs. When you hit a target who is off guard, you don't just deal extra damage, but you actually begin to inflict certain penalties on them. You might make them enfeebled or stupefied or flat-footed until the end of your next turn. The main thing that you need to know about debilitations is, no matter how many debilitation options that you have at any given moment, you can only apply one debilitation against a given target, and if you apply a new debilitation against that same target, they lose the previous debilitation. So you do have to be a little strategic in how you apply them, but as I mentioned, debilitations show up around 9th level and later, so this is not a level of complexity that you really have to deal with at level 1 when you're playing a rogue. You'll have plenty of time to adjust to how debilitations are going to affect your character. Now, those are the only two key terms that the class sidebar gives us, but there are some other key terms that I feel rogue players need to be aware of. And we already referenced one of them, flat-footed. Flat-footed is a catch-all term describing situations where your opponent doesn't have the ability to defend themselves, and as a result they take a -2 penalty to their armor class. If an opponent is flat-footed, you get sneak attack damage when you strike them using certain weapons, which we'll talk about here in a moment. As a rogue, your damage output and your effectiveness in combat is going to be tied to finding ways to make your opponents flat-footed. Flat-footed is a powerful condition for you, and so you want to know not just what the condition does, but how you can inflict that condition upon your opponents. Next up, let's talk about weapon traits, because rogues really care about two weapon traits in particular, agile and finesse. Earlier we said that you can get sneak attack damage when you use certain weapons against a flat-footed opponent, and the weapons that you need to use are either agile weapons, finesse weapons, or ranged weapons. Agile weapons are weapons that lower the multiple attack penalty that you receive when you strike multiple times inside the same round, and finesse weapons are weapons that allow you to use your dexterity modifier to attack rather than your strength modifier. Both of these traits represent weapons that are often lighter, quicker, or more nimble, and as a result, they are the ideal weapons to use to catch your opponents off guard. Now, there is one final key term that I want to mention here, and I'm a little disappointed in Paizo that they didn't include this term with the rogue class sidebar. That is the term incapacitation. Incapacitation is a trait that can get applied to certain attacks, and while rogues don't have many incapacitation effects, in fact their main one comes at level 20, rogues still do have some incapacitation abilities, and so you do want to be aware of what incapacitation means, and basically it means not as effective against higher level opponents. Incapacitation effects are often very brutal effects, but they are less effective against higher level opponents. In other words, incapacitation effects are often less effective against boss fights inside the game. However, most of your rogue abilities are not incapacitation abilities, so most of the time this isn't something you're going to need to worry about. It's just still something I wanted you to be aware of. So when it comes to the rogue class, the role is going to be the skill monkey or utility character for your party. You're looking at an overall complexity of 2 to 4 out of 10, and the key terms that you want to be aware of are flourish, debilitation, flat-footed, agile and finesse weapon traits, and the incapacitation trait. Now let's move on to the strengths of the rogue class. Now the very first thing that I want to say about the strengths of the rogue class is the word flexibility is basically just going to be a running theme. If I mentioned flexibility at every point in this video that I could mention flexibility, this video would be probably an extra 10 minutes. So any point I make, just hear the word flexibility in the back of your mind. But let's go to the core strength of the rogue class, which is its role as skill monkey. Rogues have skills and skills and skills and skills. Just 4 days, they push the skills side of the game about as far as you can go. Rogues are the best skill-based class in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, bar none. The Investigator from the Advanced Player's Guide comes close, but suffers some constraints that prevent it from going as far as the Rogue class goes. If you want to be a utility player, if you want to bring a ton of skills to the table, Rogue is the class for you. The Rogue class begins trained in the stealth skill, and then gets an additional 1 or 2 skills depending on its subclass. Then it gets another 7 trained skills, plus a number of trained skills equal to its intelligence modifier. And that's before bonus trained skills from your background, or ancestry feats, or anything like that. Rogues have tons of skills. I created a build that deliberately ignored intelligence. I didn't want intelligence to be part of the rogue build because I wanted to test something. And I discovered that a level 1 rogue, starting with a 10 intelligence, begins the game proficient in approximately 70% of the available skills that aren't just a subcategory of the lore skill. If you are playing an average intelligence human rogue, you can begin at trained proficiency in 70% of the skills in the game. That is huge. After I did that level 1 build for a human rogue with basic intelligence, I decided to push the rogue and see what I could do with it. And there are certain level 1 rogue builds, there are certain subclasses where you can start with an 18 intelligence and you can begin the game proficient in every single skill in the game, again, that's not some specific lore subcategory. It is possible to have a level 1 rogue that can literally do anything that the skill system has to offer. And the advantage for rogues when it comes to skills don't stop there. Every class gets regular skill increases in skill feats, but rogues get extra skill increases in skill feats. In fact, over 20 levels of play, rogues will get 10 extra skill feats and 9 extra skill increases compared to almost any other class in the game. That is a massive advantage when it comes to taking advantage of the skill system in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. It is seriously hard to overstate just how overpowered rogues are in the skill department of Pathfinder 2nd Edition, but that is not all that the rogue class has to offer. Rogues also prove really strong in the perception category. Every class in the game has an automatic progression when it comes to perception. And Rogue is one of the few classes that actually gets to legendary perception in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. So, if you're looking for a character that's going to be perceptive, going to be able to find traps, spot enemies, detect ambushes, that kind of thing, Rogue is definitely one of the best classes for that particular role inside the game. In fact, while I don't necessarily think it is the best build for a rogue, I will go ahead and tell you that an Eldritch Trickster rogue using either the Cleric or Druid multi-class option has the potential to have the highest perception score of any class inside of Pathfinder 2nd Edition. That's saying something. There are some rogues that can outdo the Ranger when it comes to finding enemies. Wow. The other major strength of rogues that I really want to emphasize for this video is the sneak attack ability, and starting at 9th level, their debilitations that they can add to sneak attack. Sneak attack is going to be your main avenue for adding damage as a rogue, so if you really want to spit out some extra damage, you need to be catching enemies off guard, you need to be catching them while they're flat-footed. The sneak attack ability caps out at an additional 4d6 damage, which is more powerful than the most potent striking rune you can actually add to one of your weapons. Sneak attack is where rogues have the potential to deal out incredible amounts of damage, and I love the debilitations that rogues can add on top of their sneak attack damage. Debilitations can do some pretty potent things. One of the thief subclass specific debilitations can make someone flat-footed for an entire round. You can inflict the enfeebled condition. The Eldritch Trickster subclass has the ability to make enemy casters stupefied, which can actually cause spells to just fizzle. There are a lot of very potent debuffs that the rogue has the potential to inflict on enemies inside of combat. So the debilitations, when they kick in for the rogue, they are just a potent ability that you can use as long as you can catch your enemies off guard. So I definitely encourage you, don't overlook just how powerful sneak attack and debilitations are to what you can accomplish as a rogue. Now, really quick, I want to run over some more generic strengths of the rogue class, starting with options. Rogues have a lot of options when it comes to class feats. They're not quite as crazy as the fighter class, but they are one of the classes with a higher total of just class feat options inside of the game. In fact, the core rulebook has over 50 class feats for just the base rogue alone. So if you're looking for an adaptable class with a lot of options, rogue is a good choice for you. Also, we'll get into this in the character builds options here in a moment, but I just want to say, rogue is the class with some of the best consistently good subclass options in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. There are a lot of classes that have subclass choices, but frequently with subclasses you'll find some options are very compelling and other options are weaker or less compelling or just too niche to really make you want to go in that direction. But I will say, so far, Pathfinder 2nd Edition has brought some consistent quality to the subclasses for the rogue, and it's really one of the impressive aspects of the class. Finally, for a class that's not really focused on combat, rogues are better in a fight than you would expect them to be. Rogues eventually get to master proficiency with their weapons and with light armor, and if you're playing a ruffian rogue, they actually get to master proficiency with medium armor as well. And to give you a comparison, the Barbarian and the Ranger, which are both more combat-oriented than the Rogue, also progress to master with their weapons and armor, and they both cap at medium armor, meaning that the Rogue, at least in terms of base proficiency, is about on par with the Barbarian and the Ranger when it comes to just a stand-up fight. Now, obviously, Barbarian and Ranger, they've definitely got some tricks that push them harder in that direction, but when you're looking at the Rogue class, realize that they have more to offer in a fight than you might realize when you're first examining them. Okay, so it's obvious that the Rogue class brings a lot to the table, but let's move on to question number 3. What are the weaknesses of the Rogue class? Well, there are 3 big weaknesses that I feel like we need to discuss. Number 1, low damage. Number 2, light armor. And number 3, MAD, multiple attribute dependency. So let's break these down. First, low damage. I mentioned earlier that the primary source of damage for rogues is sneak attack, and that sneak attack is actually more potent than the most potent striking rune a rogue can put on their weapon, and that kind of highlights one of the main issues for the rogue class, which is if you aren't using sneak attack, you are not dealing nearly as much damage as other classes inside the game. Fighters, rangers, barbarians, they have the ability to spit out high damage totals with pretty relative ease, whereas for the rogue, you have to deal damage in the right instances in order to rack up comparable damage totals. a rogue in a straight fight is probably not dealing anywhere near the damage of the more martially inclined characters in their party. This is compounded by the fact that in order for rogues to deal sneak attack damage, they need to use agile, finesse, or ranged weapons. Now, in Pathfinder 2nd Edition's defense, there are plenty of options for weapons with the agile or finesse trait, or for ranged weapons. A rogue's not going to start proficient in all of these, but there are around 25 different options in the core rulebook alone. So depending on the rogue plus what ancestry choices they make, you probably have a solid selection of agile and finesse weapons that you can use. But the vast majority of agile and finesse weapons are going to deal 1d4 or 1d6 as their base damage. In fact, as far as I know inside of the game, there is only one agile or finesse weapon that actually deals 1d8 damage, and it's kind of a niche weapon for elves. So, while other characters in your party are going to be using heavy-hitting weapons, you're probably going to be dealing with lighter weapons that don't pack quite the same punch. So, if your rogue isn't catching people off guard, you can probably expect them to deal only minor amounts of damage. And this is compounded by the fact that the majority of rogues are going to be running around in light armor, which means your AC is not going to be as good as the other martial characters inside your group. Now, other than fighters and champions, most classes are going to be medium armor and down, but rogues, you're using light armor, and that means that your AC total is probably not going to be as high as other classes, which means that ultimately you're more likely to suffer hits and critical hits, which means that a straight fight can go badly for you very quickly. Now on these first 2 points, low damage dice and light armor, the ruffian subclass of rogue that we're going to talk about later is going to offset these points. Ruffians do a little bit better in these departments, but even ruffians are going to find that their damage and armor as compared to strictly martial classes is not going to be quite as good, and sneak attack is there to help make up that difference. But this final point is a little more applicable to all subclasses of rogues, and this is something that you will encounter in many role-playing games, what is commonly known as multiple attribute dependency. Some characters rely almost exclusively on one attribute in terms of their character build. The barbarian cares about strength and pretty much nothing else. The wizard wants high intelligence, and its other attributes can really be anything, and they'll still be effective. The rogue, though, is a class that is going to be pulled in multiple directions. Can a rogue use strength? Yeah. Can a rogue use dex? Oh, definitely. Does a rogue want constitution? Yeah, probably. There's going to be some poison saves in there. What about intelligence? Well, rogues have to be cunning, don't they? What about wisdom? You need to find traps. What about charisma? Often rogues are the face. You can kind of see rogues are attribute hungry in a way that other classes truly are not. In the previous section, when we talked about strengths, we mentioned that the rogue is a very flexible class, and that is true, but one of the dangers of flexibility is that if you try to do too many things, you end up not doing any one thing well and kind of feeling weak compared to other characters, and that is a danger that the rogue can fall into. As a rogue, there are going to be compelling reasons to invest in all of the attributes. And rogues actually come with the widest array of possible primary attributes for any class. Rogues can potentially start with strength, dexterity, intelligence, wisdom, or charisma as their primary attribute. That should give you an idea of just how diverse this class is, and it is easy to end up in a situation where you try to do too many things. So just as a warning, if you are considering playing a rogue, remember that you want to know what your focus is. You can definitely dabble in other areas, and you definitely should dabble in other areas. All good rogues have a habit of getting involved in things that they probably shouldn't. but never let the diversity of your skills steal away from the focus that you need to maintain. By the way, if you are playing a rogue subclass that doesn't have dexterity as its primary attribute, this multiple attribute dependency issue is even more prominent for you and something you're going to want to pay closer attention to. But let's move on to the fourth question in this video. What are the character build options for the rogue class? Now, thankfully, unlike the fighter, the rogue class is going to come with defined subclasses that we get to pick from. There are 3 subclasses in the core rulebook, and there are 2 more subclasses in the Advanced Player's Guide, so we're going to talk about those 5 subclasses today. But before I get into those subclasses, I just want to reiterate that the rogue class is very flexible in their build options. You might think that having defined subclasses would have a negative impact on your overall options, but the rogue class remains very flexible. It has several different build strategies that can combine reasonably well with most, if not all, of the subclasses that the rogue has for play. So, for example, you can build a 2-weapon fighting rogue, or you can build a rogue that focuses on trap finding. There are rogue builds that make heavy use of ranged weapons, and there are a plethora of powerful defensive reactions available to the rogue class, and all of those options that I just mentioned to you, you can combine them reasonably well with any subclass. Do you want to play a ranged combat focused rogue with the Eldritch Trickster subclass? Go for it. Do you want to play a mastermind who uses the trap finding abilities? That's completely legit. You can mix and match these options really, really well to come up with a diversity of playstyles for your rogue characters. But at the end of the day, the defining aspect of your playstyle is probably going to be the rogue's racket that you choose. In Pathfinder 2nd Edition, each rogue subclass is called a racket, and it represents the kind of less than legal activity that your character is known for. In the core rulebook, you have the Ruffian racket, the Scoundrel racket, and the Thief racket. And then in the Advanced Player's Guide, you have the Eldritch Trickster racket and the Mastermind racket. Here's a quick description of what each racket has to offer. The Ruffian racket is the rogue that enjoys mixing it up in combat more than other rogues. The Ruffian you might imagine as a character who used to live as a bandit, or maybe as a tough for a street gang or something to that effect. They are rogues that like to fight, but like to fight dirty. The Ruffian rogue is going to be trained in the Intimidation skill. They're going to be able to use a slightly larger selection of weapons when it comes to sneak attack. And they're also going to be proficient in medium armor in addition to light armor. So if you're worried about the combat side of the rogue class, the Ruffian might give you that extra little oomph that you need to get through some particularly dangerous fight scenes. You still want to fight dirty, you still want to catch your foes off guard, but the Ruffian is going to be a little bit more capable when it comes to those fights. The Scoundrel, meanwhile, is your classic con artist. The rogue that relies on their wit to win over strangers and their scathing words to confound their enemies. You will be trained in deception and diplomacy, and as a Scoundrel you will also find that the effects of your feint action are much more potent, especially when you score a critical success. If you're looking for a rogue who's going to have a winning smile and a far too dangerous charisma score, Scoundrel may be the perfect choice for you. Then there's the Thief, also known as Dexterity is the God stat. The Thief is your classic rogue archetype of the guy who steals things. I don't think I have to explain this in too much depth, but you will be trained in the thievery skill, and you will also find that as a thief, when you use a finesse weapon, you don't just add your dexterity modifier to the attack roll, you also add it to the damage roll. That's right, the Thief Rogue Racket is the option if you want to use dexterity for your armor class, for your attack, and for your damage. If you enjoy those characters who use dexterity as a god stat inside of RPGs, Thief is the perfect option for you. The Advanced Player's Guide introduced 2 more rogue rackets, and the first one I want to talk about is the Mastermind racket, which allows you to make really strong use of the recall knowledge activity. Masterminds will be trained in the society skill, and then one of 4 other skills that are designed around the recall knowledge action. And the core of the Mastermind Rogue is recall knowledge. They are the version of the rogue that likes to spend time analyzing their enemies. They take a moment, consider their foe, identify weaknesses, and then target those weaknesses with brutal efficiency. If you enjoyed the movie Sherlock Holmes: A Game of Shadows, where Sherlock and Moriarty are planning their moves before they actually start fighting with opponent, and they map out each strike and each attack that they're going to use, if you enjoy that feel to combat, Mastermind is a perfect way to replicate that style of fighting. Masterminds are highly intelligent and use their intelligence for lethal effect on the field of battle. And then there is the Eldritch Trickster. Now, normally I don't get into edition wars. Pathfinder 2nd Edition is my game, but I like D&D 5e. It's a fun game. I've played it plenty of times. But in this instance, I have to say, Paizo's Eldritch Trickster knocks D&D 5e's Arcane Trickster completely out of the water. The Eldritch Trickster subclass is so wonderfully done, and it builds off of the multi-class archetype rules in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. If you're going to use Eldritch Trickster, I'll go ahead and tell you, you want to be familiar with how the multi-class archetype rules work. Because essentially what the Eldritch Trickster is going to do is it's going to give you a free multi-class archetype. At level 1, you start out as a rogue, but you also pick up a multi-class archetype feat for one of these spellcasting classes inside of Pathfinder 2e. And this, by the way, is an incredibly wide open option. Essentially, as long as the spellcasting class has a basic spellcasting feat, you are allowed to pick it for your multi-class choice. So, it is possible to have an Eldritch Trickster who is part Bard, Druid, Cleric, Wizard, Sorcerer, Oracle, or Witch. That is 7 options for the Eldritch Trickster. That is amazing to me. As a result of these multi-class archetype feats, you're going to start with some cantrips according to whichever multi-class archetype you're using, and you will also get a skill related to that particular multi-class archetype. For example, if you were doing an Eldritch Trickster with the Cleric multi-class, you would get the Religion skill, but if you were using the Wizard multi-class, you would get the Arcane skill instead. Now, I will tell you that the Eldritch Trickster is probably the most complex version of the rogue. There are a lot of extra details that you really want to consider if you're looking at the Eldritch Trickster, and if you remember the multiple attribute dependency weakness that we talked about earlier, the Eldritch Trickster rogue is the most susceptible to this particular problem. But if you want to mix cunning tactics and spellcasting, Eldritch Trickster is the go-to option inside this game. I absolutely love it. So let's move on to our last question, which is, how do I get the most out of the rogue class? And if there's one guiding principle that I really want to give you for the rogue class, it is this: play slow, play smart. Your main trained skill is stealth, and that implies a character who is taking their time, who is approaching problems in a very methodical way, and who is taking steps to make sure that they're going to be successful. As a rogue, you want to be careful, and you want to make sure that you're not getting in over your head. Or, at the very least, you want to make sure you have an escape plan. That means, among other things, that the rogue is a class that needs to be considering exploration mode in Pathfinder 2nd Edition a little more carefully than other classes. Now, for those of you who do not know, Pathfinder 2nd Edition can break down into roughly 3 types of gameplay: encounter mode, exploration mode, and downtime mode. Encounter mode is your turn-by-turn sequence of events, better known as the fight scenes. If there's an enemy on the board and you are actively trying to kill them, that is encounter mode. Downtime mode is the long stretches of time that are kind of glossed over in terms of gameplay, where characters are resting, recovering, maybe crafting items or doing research, those kinds of things. But in between those 2 modes of play is exploration mode. That is the point in play where your party is moving from room to room and actively exploring a particular environment. And this is where the rogue shines and also needs to take some steps to make sure they're getting the most out of their class. In Pathfinder 2nd Edition, characters can use what are known as exploration activities, which kind of represents different strategies for what you are doing as you explore your environment. There are a ton of examples I could go into. I'm not going to try to hit them all, but for a couple of quick examples, your rogue could be scouting ahead for the party or actively searching for traps. If you're actively searching for traps, then anytime your party might encounter a trap, the DM is automatically going to give you a roll to find that trap. Whereas if you're using the scouting activity, you can give your entire party a bonus to initiative when the fight actually breaks out. Exploration activities are very powerful, and being deliberate about how you use them is going to have a profound impact on gameplay. But there is one exploration activity that, as a rogue, you really want to make sure you are aware of. It's not necessarily one you're going to use, but it is definitely one that you want to talk to your party about. Follow the expert. In Pathfinder 2nd Edition, being untrained in a skill, especially after low levels, like level 1, 2, and 3, untrained isn't too bad, but once you start getting up past level 5, being untrained in a skill can be brutal. The potential downsides of a critical failure on a skill roll can really hamper characters and hamper a party, and it is basically a meme that rogues constantly want to strangle their allies for being way too noisy while the rogue is trying to infiltrate a particular location. Well, Pathfinder 2nd Edition has baked an exploration activity into the rule set to kind of help offset these problems. If your party champion is untrained in stealth, and that heavy armor is almost certainly going to be a dead giveaway for your party's position, you can have the party champion make use of the follow the expert ability so that the champion can attempt to mimic the actions you take as you're stealthing your way through a particular location. Sure, follow the expert is not going to have quite the same bonuses as you will have, but it can make all the difference between your paladin exposing the location of the entire party and allowing your group to avoid what might otherwise be an extremely dangerous encounter. Following the expert is the strategy for helping an untrained party member get past a skill check that they might otherwise have no chance of beating. And remember earlier we said that as a rogue, you have skills on skills on skills on skills? The reality is, it is almost mathematically impossible for you not to be trained in the skill that your party member is untrained in. So if you have a party member who is facing a particularly dangerous skill check that they are not prepared for, you are almost certainly the perfect person for them to imitate, and convincing your party members to use the follow the expert activity can really help your party be in a better position before combat breaks out, or possibly put your party in the position that combat is completely avoided. You may not be the one using follow the expert, but because you are the expert, you are raising the skill level of your entire party. Now, we have already talked about how important sneak attack and debilitations are to the rogue class. You want to catch your opponents flat-footed as often as possible, So we've already kind of hit those things, but I want to dig into that a little bit more because as a rogue, you need to be actively searching for ways to make your opponents flat-footed. The classic way to make an opponent flat-footed is simply to get into flanking. If you and an ally are on opposite sides of the creature, you give that creature the flat-footed condition, which means you're going to be triggering the sneak attack damage and at higher level the debilitations that we talked about earlier. Flanking is kind of the go-to method for a lot of rogues when it comes to inflicting the flat-footed penalty, but it's not your only option. First off, at level 1, rogues get the ability that if they roll certain skills for initiative, such as stealth and deception, then any opponent that hasn't acted before the rogue automatically has flat-footed because of the skill the rogue was using. So as a rogue, you want to be deliberate about how you enter combat. If you think combat is about to happen, look for ways to justify using stealth or deception as your initiative roll, and you are automatically going to be debuffing any enemy that is slow to react. Now, I will say in regards to that ability that the core rulebook gives only 2 skills, stealth and deception, as the skills that rogues can use to trigger the flat-footed penalty. As a storyteller, I would be open to negotiation, where if a rogue wanted to trade one of those skills out, based on maybe their rogue racket, I would be open to that possibility. So for example, if a ruffian rogue wanted to trade out deception for intimidate when it came to the initiative and inflicting flat-footed, I would be open to that. That is not rules as written, but that may be something you can talk to your game master about, because I think it's reasonable in terms of how the rules work. But the options for inflicting the flat-footed condition don't stop there. We've already mentioned the feint action, and if you're a scoundrel rogue, this is going to be a very important action for you. The feint action potential to make a target flat-footed, and the scoundrel rogue can push that debuff to some pretty crazy places. If you can trick an enemy into overextending themselves, you can expose them to that extra damage from sneak attack. Finally, let's talk about the hide and sneak actions. In Pathfinder 2nd Edition, stealth has been reworked in a way where hide and sneak is a lot more useful in combat. In other fantasy RPGs like Pathfinder 1st Edition, you often use stealth before the fight, but then once the fight scene started, it was hard to use stealth during actual combat. Well, in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, you can use the hide and sneak actions in combat. So if you're in combat, you can totally move behind a tree and use the hide action to gain the hidden condition against your foes. And from there, you can even use the sneak action to move to other locations so that your foes don't necessarily know where you've gone. If you are hidden relative to one of your foes, they are actually flat-footed relative to you. So it is completely legitimate for a rogue to hide behind cover and then pop out and fire their bow and land a sneak attack because their enemy is now flat-footed. There are obviously a lot of other ways you can inflict the flat-footed penalty inside the game. There are going to be class feats and maybe tactical options that other characters in your party can use. I'm not going to dig into everything here, but as a rogue, anytime you see the possibility of making an opponent flat-footed, you want to make that happen because that is going to increase your damage, it's going to help you debuff the enemy, it is going to make you far more effective in combat. For this last part of how to get the most out of the rogue class, let's talk about the core of your strength, the fact that you are the party skill monkey. I mentioned earlier that rogues get more skill improvements and skill feats than any other class inside the game, and this is very potent for you. Number one, I would be talking to the other players in your group and figuring out what their specialties are. Since you have the capacity to cover 70% or more of the skills inside the game, as a rogue, it is really easy for you to let the other party members say, I want this specialty, and then you can go and kind of fill in all of the other gaps. The wizard says, I want to specialize in arcane. The ranger says, I want to specialize in survival. The barbarian says, I'm going to specialize in athletics. Cool, you now know you can leave those things alone, and you can push the other skills in the game to whatever ludicrous degree you might desire. But there is another aspect of your skill game that I want to talk about that can be really, really powerful. Retraining. Pathfinder 2nd Edition has made character retraining rules part of the core rulebook. Characters in Pathfinder 2nd Edition can, with relative ease, retrain almost anything on their character sheet. Class feats can be retrained, spells can be retrained for casting characters. There's lots of different things you can do, and I'm going to go ahead and tell you, I went and checked, and this specific example is used. You can retrain skill improvements, and you can retrain skill feats. As a rogue, you have a wide selection of skills available, and you have the option to go in and retrain which skills you are focused in. It takes a week of downtime per skill improvement and a week of downtime per skill feat, but every single skill feat option inside of the Pathfinder 2nd Edition core rulebook, with a little bit of time and a little bit of effort, your character can access it. Remember earlier when I said play slow and play smart? This is one of the ways that a rogue can do exactly that. If you receive a mission to steal a particular artifact, if you receive a mission to break into a particular location, as a rogue, it is completely rational for you to spend some downtime researching the target, and then spend some downtime training in the exact skills you're going to need to go in and take that target down. Retraining is incredibly potent, and as a rogue, you have more increases than any other class in the game, allowing you to use the retraining rules rather liberally. Also, technically, this isn't part of the skill feat conversation, but I would just like to throw out there, pay attention to your general feat choices as well. As a rogue, you're going to get up to Legendary Perception, and there are several general feats that will improve your ability to use Perception. Most notably, the level 19 general feat, True Perception, is probably something every rogue ever would want to consider. But those are just some of the things you can do to get the most out of the rogue class, and I'm going to go ahead and say this video has gone a lot longer than I originally intended, so I am going to stop the video here, but let me throw the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts on the rogue class? Do you agree with my assessment? Do you disagree with my assessment? Are there some strengths of the rogue class that I forgot to mention? Are there some weaknesses of the rogue class that I overlooked? And do you have any thoughts on what a rogue player could do to get the most out of the class at their gaming table? Leave your thoughts in the comments section down below. Also, if you enjoyed this video, like it and share it, subscribe to the channel. We are getting extremely close to the 100 subscribers mark, and I don't know what I'm going to do when we hit that mark, but it's a cool mark and I'm trying to think of something. So please like and share the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for being a part of this conversation, and have a wonderful day. Okay, so if you stuck around this long, we get a little bit of a fun extra at the end of this video. Today, I got my first dose of the COVID vaccine, and I just want to give a huge thank you to the medical professionals who have been fighting against this disease. I want to give a huge thank you to all of the people that have been taking steps to help get life back to normal. Rogues everywhere can tell you that fortitude saves are a bad idea, so I am so thankful that I was able to get my first dose of the vaccine, and I am so thankful that I am one step closer to a return of just normal gaming. So I just want to encourage you, if you have not gotten the vaccine yet, check and see if you are eligible for the vaccine. Sign up for an appointment. It is just one small step that helps us get back to a normal life and a normal gaming routine. And I just wanted to celebrate all of the fantastic scientists and medical professionals and people out there who have been taking steps to help combat this terrible pandemic. I have been blessed that my immediate family has managed to avoid COVID, but I know it has impacted a lot of people out there, and there are some fantastic people doing some amazing work to get our communities back to normal, and I just truly appreciate each and every one of you. Have a wonderful day.